Hi, I'm Katie von Holzen, and today I have with me Dr. Megan Gross, who is an associate professor, recently tenured, I might add, so congratulations, Megan,
Thank you.
in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she has worked since 2018. She completed a master's in speech language pathology and a PhD in communication sciences and disorders at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, examining the linguistic, social, and cognitive factors involved in bilingual children's code switching. Her research has focused on bilingual language development and neurodiversity, code switching, cognitive control, bilingual assessment, and family-centered intervention. Her lab is currently working on two projects, Español et Anglais à la V, listening and talking in two languages, and project ABC Familias, Autism, Bilingualism, and Communication in Familias Latinas, which we'll get to talk about a bit in this interview. She is also a bilingual speech language pathologist. So, welcome, Megan. And I'd
Thank
actually
you.
like to start out right there with your work as a bilingual speech language pathologist. What kind of cases do you work, and how does this inform your research? And specifically, why did you specialize in bilingualism?
So, as a speech language pathologist, I've worked mostly with children, particularly children on the autism spectrum. And so I would say the current focus of my research on bilingualism and autism has really been fueled by my clinical experiences working with bilingual families. So I've noticed that sometimes families will make different language choices for children in the same household, depending on their level of spoken language skills. So, for example, having one child who's attending a bilingual school and another child in the same family receiving input mostly in English. And so this led me to want to better understand more about bilingual development in the context of autism. In terms of your second question about specializing in bilingualism, I would say that the interest in bilingualism actually came first, and that led me to speech language pathology a little bit later. So I grew up in a monolingual household, but in New York City, surrounded by a variety of different languages. And when I was in middle school and high school, most of my friends were bilingual. And so I would hear them speaking in Chinese or in Korean when they would call their parents. And I was very curious and a little bit envious about that experience that they had of being able to communicate in more than one language. And so then I started reading a little bit about language in the brain for a research project in high school, and that led me to bilingual aphasia and some of the really fascinating work that has been done about what happens to an individual's languages when they speak more than one language and they have aphasia. And so that got me kind of interested in speech language pathology. Then I took a little detour into psycholinguistics as an undergraduate student, but then came back to speech language pathology for graduate school.
So it sounds like you've been able to kind of marry two major interests in your life.
Mhm.
And I have to say, a detour to psycholinguistics is never a bad idea.
I think it very
Awesome.
much informs my work too. I feel like I'm kind of half speech language pathologist and half psycholinguist and try to apply some of the psycholinguistic lens, but then also the clinical application.
Fantastic. Yeah. So in the first place, what made you want to do this PhD in communication sciences and disorders and eventually continue to work in academia?
So I think my path may be a little bit unusual. I didn't like start out as a clinician and then decide to go back and get my PhD. I was actually really interested in research from the beginning. And I think part of this is because I was very lucky to have the chance to work in a research lab my last year of high school. And so that got me really interested in a research career. And then as I considered that, I also really wanted to have clinical training and experience as well. And so when I started graduate school, I ended up entering a combined program that was both a master's in speech language pathology with clinical training and then also a PhD. And so that gave me the chance to kind of pursue both paths. And I will say, in terms of being in academia, there have definitely been times along the way where I wasn't quite sure that was going to be the right fit for me. But I think now that I'm more settled and have been, in my role as a professor for a while, I'm really lucky to say that I love my job. I really enjoy that I get to provide training to students in the classroom, also in my research lab, and to contribute to clinical work by interacting with practicing clinicians through professional development and through research projects, and then also getting to interact with community organizations and with the families that participate in our research and also help to kind of push our research forward.
I think that clinicians end up, as a clinician, researchers end up having the best of both worlds a little bit, right?
Hmm.
So you get to do all of the fun research stuff that you already fell in love with, it sounds like, in high school. What an excellent opportunity. And that is actually a pretty atypical path for somebody who does end up doing a PhD in communication sciences and disorders. Um, so you get to do all of the fun research things, but also the fun clinician things, right?
Hmm.
That can be so rewarding as well. And being able to get out and actually speak with people in the community. Yeah, that's
Hmm.
fantastic. So let's talk about one of those ways that you are actually working on one of these research projects. So one of your current projects is called Español et Inglés a la vez, which is Spanish and English at the same time. So a la vez is at the same time.
Hmm.
So listening and talking in two languages, which your lab has been conducting over the past few years over Zoom. So like we are talking now.
Hmm.
So please tell me us more about this project. What kind of data are you collecting and what have you been able to find?
So this project is looking at how bilingual children with various neurodevelopmental profiles or conditions use their language resources when interacting with different conversation partners. So it uses a scripted Confederate dialogue task, so drawing on some of the psycholinguistic background there, um, in which children take turns interacting with a conversation partner. And that conversation partner is actually a pre-recorded video so that we have control over what each child is hearing.
Oh.
But to the child, the idea is that they think it's just another person on Zoom that they're interacting with in real time. And what we're manipulating is the language of that partner. So the child does this task 3 times, once with a partner, Maria, who only speaks Spanish and says that very explicitly when introducing herself to the children. Once with Ashley, who only speaks English, and again says that very explicitly when introducing herself to the children. And then once with Carmen, who's bilingual and introduces herself using both languages and engages in code switching throughout the task. And so what the children need to do is they see 2 pictures on their screen and they hear their partner describe one of them. And they have to select the picture that they think she's talking about.
Mm.
And then they see one picture and their partner invites them to describe the picture so that their partner can then find that picture on her screen. And so what we're looking at, in particular, the data we're analyzing are the picture descriptions that the children provide and how these may vary depending on which person they're interacting with. And in this project, we have children who have typical language development, children who are meeting our criteria for risk of developmental language disorder or DLD. And then we have a small subsample of children with an autism diagnosis. And these are children ages 4, 5, 6, 7,
Mhm.
throughout the US because it's on Zoom,
Right.
but all exposed to Spanish from birth and then exposed to English kind of at varying times during their development. And
That's
maybe I'll pause there before I jump into the findings. Yeah.
yeah. And so I actually so I would actually like to ask a quick question here because I'm thinking
Yeah.
about we were talking before about being in different places as our family and having to travel. And so something like Zoom becomes really important for maintaining communication. Out of curiosity, the child participants you have in this study, how much experience did they have with Zoom? For example, if they're living away from family, living with grandparents, that actually makes it a very interesting population, right? For that aspect.
Yes. And I've actually seen, I'm forgetting now who did the study, but someone did a project on interactions with grandparents via Zoom. In the context of bilingualism that I think was fascinating. I wish I could remember the details of it. But also, we started this project, in the middle of the pandemic. It wasn't initially intended to be on Zoom. it was going to be in person with eye tracking, and we had to kind of pivot.
Mm.
But I think that ended up helping us in some ways because children were quite familiar with Zoom because they
Mm.
were, using it for school, or some of them were receiving their speech therapy services over Zoom. But I think some of them do also have experience talking with grandparents over Zoom as well, or FaceTime, or some kind of video chatting.
Yeah, I think maybe especially this population. Yeah, I've also heard of
Hmm.
that study and it's not coming to my mind right now. Maybe I'll put it in the comments afterwards. So, okay, very interesting setup, very interesting population. So what kinds of things have you found?
So we're still in the process of analyzing the data, and I think it's a really rich data set that we can look at in a variety of ways. But one key finding that we've been identifying is the important role that context plays when examining children's code switching behavior.
Hmm.
I think previous research, especially with children with language impairment, has looked at their code switching mostly in single language contexts.
Mm.
So, interacting with someone in only one language, telling a narrative where they're encouraged to use one language. And so we often see a relationship between proficiency and code switching, where children who code switch more may have lower proficiency in the target language of that
Mm.
interaction. But I think that's providing us only part of the picture because they're in that kind of single language context. And
Mhm.
so what we're finding with our data is, yes, when we look at the English and the Spanish conditions with Maria and Ashley, there is an association with children's lexical knowledge. So they will code switch more if their lexical knowledge, let's say in English, is lower while they're interacting with Ashley, and vice versa for Maria. But
Mhm.
in the code switching condition, we actually see a flat line or even potentially a positive relationship between their lexical knowledge and their code switching.
Mm.
So this idea of, I think, it can be kind of a deficit way of thinking about code switching. Um, I think is informed very much by looking only at those single language contexts. And if we open that up and look at a bilingual context, I think it helps to frame code switching as more of a resourceful way that children are using all of the tools that they have.
And also a way that they're kind of adjusting to the interlocutor, right? So
Hmm.
that it shows actually very sophisticated social understanding, sociolinguistic
Yeah,
understanding. Yeah. Oh, that's
yeah,
very
definitely.
important.
And
Yeah.
actually, kind of related to that, one of the things we've been seeing with our small subsample of autistic participants is, in particular, just seeing how they respond to the code switching condition.
Hmm.
And so, among the 5 children, we have some who just continued using the language that they preferred when they were with the bilingual partner. But we had 2 children who code switched almost every picture description with that partner, including one whose parents had actually said that the child does not like code switching. Um, so seeing how he was adjusting to the input and kind of trying to match what the partner was doing was really interesting because this child was also code switching, particularly in noun phrases. And so seeing these like very structured ways that children were trying to adapt to their partner was really interesting. And again, it's a small sample, so this is something we're going to have to look at more in the future.
Hmm. Definitely. So, we kind of touched on this already, and it sounds like the collecting data over Zoom was a bit of a pandemic necessity that I think many of
Mhm.
us had to pivot to. But in general, in a lot of your projects, you are collecting data over Zoom. So, what have you learned along the way about using such a remote data collection method?
So I think for this project in particular, with the scripted Confederate dialogue task, doing it over Zoom actually works really well. I used the same paradigm for my dissertation, and I was in person with the children. And so I think when I was sitting next to them, and then there was a partner on the computer, they were sometimes interacting more with me than with the
Mm.
partner. And it was harder to tell if their language choices were influenced by me and my identity versus the partner. But on Zoom, it was a lot easier for me to kind of fade into the background, and because I was also on Zoom. So it just felt like they were interacting with the other person kind of in a more natural way.
Mm.
Um, so I think that was helpful. It's also messier over Zoom. So you have their families in the background, and Sometimes children looking to their parent for help, or the parents maybe providing more help than I might have wanted them to. Um, but at the same time, you really see children in their natural environment. And so I was struck by some children who would, turn and say something to their parent in Spanish and then come back and speak to Ashley in English. And so it was kind
Wow.
of demonstrating those language control skills um, just in their day-to-day environment.
Yeah, so you mentioned it's a small sample, but actually it's an extremely rich um uh, uh extremely rich set of data that you have, not just necessarily your specific manipulation that you did, but also in just observing, let's say, children in their natural habitat, and
Hmm.
how they're navigating language. So that's
And
one
actually,
of,
one
well, yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to add one other component that I didn't mention is another consequence of being on Zoom is to keep children engaged. We started using these green screen activities, which is something I learned from another research team. So you change the image behind you and then you can interact with it. So I'm like baking cupcakes and putting in the eggs and things like that. And so this was kind of a break for the child, but we've actually been starting to transcribe these as more of a conversational language sample. And so also seeing children's use of code switching, for example, in that activity compared to the more structured activity has been kind of a slightly unexpected part of the data that we're starting to look at.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of extra bonus of this particular method, right? You probably or this particular data collection method. You probably would
Hmm.
not have discovered that otherwise. Super cool. So that's one of your current projects. The other one is part of an NIH K-23 Career Development Award called Project ABC Familias. I have a feeling this is probably like ABC
It
Familias.
can go either way. The title
Oh,
works in both languages, which is the
ooh,
goal.
beautiful. Wow. Okay. I love it when those research projects or lab names come together and they're just kind of these little fun things. Well done. ABC Familias, Autism, Bilingualism, and Communication in Familias Latinas. Um, it sounds like this project is kind of just getting off the ground, but maybe you can tell us about the goals, maybe kind of the design, about what you're planning.
Sure. So this is a mixed methods project. So it has both quantitative and qualitative components. And I would say it has two kind of immediate goals, and then that's leading toward a long-term direction. So one of those immediate goals is to examine the language environment that autistic children growing up in Spanish-speaking families experience and their developing skills in terms of communication, but also in terms of cognitive skills like executive function. And with communication, we're looking at not only their expressive communication, but also language processing.
Mhm.
So, for example, we have an eye tracking task where we're looking at how children process sentences in both English and Spanish. And this includes children who are minimally speaking. So, we're especially interested in children who are receiving input in both Spanish and English, but may not be talking very much in
Mhm.
either language. And how are they processing that input? So that's kind of one piece. And then the qualitative piece is learning from families' experiences in what I
Mm,
might call the intersection of their autism journey and their language journey.
mm,
So once their child received an autism diagnosis, how are they learning about autism? What has it been like navigating, finding support services? But also making decisions about language use in their home and whether they're able to access bilingual support for
mm,
their child. So, kind of what's been going well with those support services and what they feel might be missing. And so then the long-term goal is to put together what we learned from both the quantitative and the qualitative pieces to think about moving forward what could be a community partnered intervention that we could develop to improve the support that families are receiving.
Wow, so it sounds like you're really within this project able to again marry these two parts of yourself, right? The psycholinguistic researcher person
Hmm.
with this kind of this difference between perception or comprehension and production, but then also the clinician and also trying to just better understand families and and children's experiences. Uh, I'm
Hmm.
I'm super excited about what you're going to be able to find there. That's going to be really
Thank
great.
you.
So related to that, so describing this intersection right between children with different language backgrounds, but also with and without language development disorders, especially with this focus on bilingual children with autism. Um, what do you think is important to keep in mind when working with these communities, right? They are not just a special, child population. They also have a different language background. They also have potentially a diagnosis. And so this is not only a small community, but a community that once you have made contact, you want to be able to maintain that contact with, right? So
Yeah,
how do you do
definitely.
that?
So I think the idea of maintaining contact, so I've really been one of the goals of my K-23, which is not only a research project, but it's a career development award. So I'm also getting training. So
Mm,
I've been getting training in doing mixed methods research, but also in doing community-based participatory research. And so one of the ideas is not just to kind of come in, collect the data, and then disappear, but the
mm,
goal is really to stay in contact with the families that participate in the study, to share back with them what we found, and to get input from relevant individuals in the community about what we should do with that data. And so I think one thing that's important for me to keep in mind is my positionality relative to
mm,
the community that I'm working with. I didn't grow up bilingual. I'm not Latina. I'm not autistic. I'm also not a parent. And
mm,
so I think keeping that in mind and really stepping back and recognizing I don't have the lived experience that my participants do, and taking a chance to learn from them about their experiences. And also, part of that is working with a community advisory board for this project. So we have caregivers, autistic adults, speech language pathologists, and community organization members that are part of this advisory board and helping to kind of guide the direction of the project. Um, and I think one other thing that's important to keep in mind is intersectionality. So
mm,
thinking about autism may be understood very differently in different communities. So, for example, one thing that I've been hearing from some of the families I work with is experiencing a sense of stigma from maybe some of their extended family members when it comes to talking about autism, or being even comfortable talking about autism.
yeah.
But then I've also heard from other families who say, no, my extended family has been super supportive and like helping me find resources. So I think it's especially important to try to not make assumptions
Mm,
and just take each family as the expert in their own experiences.
yeah. Fantastic. And it sounds like this particular funding scheme, I guess we could call it, is really useful for giving you the freedom to be able to kind of shape and decide what are the things you need, but also learn about what the things are that you need to be able to successfully complete such a project. Maybe moving more into the direction of our roles as employees in university, which also includes teaching. So I teach a seminar on first language acquisition. And I'm sure that you also have a decent teaching load. So I teach this class. So I'm curious, what is the most important message that you think students enrolled in such a course should get today about language acquisition or child language?
I would especially like to emphasize that bilingual first language acquisition is a really common phenomenon
Mm,
and not something that is, weird or
mm,
unusual or to be concerned about. I think often there's a very monolingual lens or focus that is kind of like, we're going to learn how it works in one language and then we'll kind of figure out other languages. And especially, I'm in the context of the United States. I think we're especially guilty of that
mm,
monolingual lens. Um, but I think it can have pretty significant consequences when it comes to thinking about children with disabilities,
mhm,
where there can be the assumption, well, if communication and language is hard for my child, people might say, just keep it simple, just speak one language. And that can actually introduce additional barriers in terms of
Mm,
being able to communicate with important people in their lives, family members, also part of shaping their cultural identity. And so I think the more we can kind of talk about bilingual first language acquisition as just a typical process that's common throughout the world and try to kind of counteract that um, viewing monolingual as the standard. I guess that's something that I think is important to convey to our future students and scholars.
I agree fully. I think that uh, this is I think one of the great things about language is that it's not just communication, but it's also things like social emotional well-being, identity, things like that come through in language. And I think we need to remember to keep that in mind and to respect that it's not just about um, these interesting mechanisms and things like that, but these are real people and these are really their lives that we're thinking about. So after all, this is an IASCL interview, so
Mhm.
I feel that we can also talk about a few IASCL things. So
Yeah.
you attended IASCL 2024 in Prague. We unfortunately didn't have a chance to meet because there were if I remember correctly, 600 or 700 attendees. So unfortunately, we didn't get to meet. But I'm curious, what was your conference experience like? And maybe a bit more specifically, what do you think that this IASCL Congress we have every 3 years, what do you think it means to child language researchers?
I had a wonderful experience at the conference in 2024. And especially, I was able to bring two of my doctoral students with me, and they actually were the ones who gave our presentation. And this was their first time presenting at a conference. So I think that was a really exciting experience for them. And in particular, for one of my doctoral students, she kind of had this aha moment during some of the talks that she attended that has helped to shape the direction of her dissertation research. And so it was a really formative experience for her. Um, and I think in general, the IASCL Congress provides a really valuable opportunity to learn from child language researchers from all over the world about things that they're working on. I also appreciate that it's a very supportive environment for junior researchers and also for students. The first IASCL I attended was the one in Amsterdam in 2014 when I was a PhD student. And I still remember, being in awe of some of the keynote speakers there and, all the inspiration I drew from the different sessions that I attended.
Wow, that's really cool that your one of your students got so much inspiration that it's shaping the course of their dissertation. Yeah, it's important to then have these kinds of outside perspectives that we as supervisors maybe can't we can't be the entire one person show doing everything. And so this is a bit of a condensed way of giving them a tour through the field. Um, so related to that, in the way that IASCL can support early career researchers, in 2024, the IASCL introduced their inaugural Early Career Researcher Award. The winner was Rowena Garcia, but you also received a commendation. Um, so congratulations about that.
Thank
And
you. I'm very grateful for that.
and also, I think hearing about your research, a very well-deserved commendation.
Thank you.
So I usually wrap up interviews with more senior scientists, asking them to give advice to early career researchers. But this time I'd like to, switch that around and ask you for your advice to senior scientists. So how do you think those who are very established, have been doing this for decades. How do you think they can better support early career researchers?
Mm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I will say, first of all, I feel very lucky to have been very supported by many different mentors throughout my research career, starting all the way back when I was in high school in a lab, through undergrad, grad school, and currently with my K-23, I have senior mentors that are guiding me through that process. Um, I think one thing I would love to see is more emphasis on community engaged research approaches. And I think that's happening in our field, but often there's get tenure first and then you can do those things.
Hmm.
And I would love to see a little bit of a shift in the culture. And I think maybe that's something senior researchers with their level of expertise and clout within the field can maybe help contribute to in terms of how it's valued within the research community to do these kinds of community engaged approaches that take more time, but I think ultimately are really important to the type of work that we do. So yeah, I'd like to see more emphasis on that in tenure and promotion and career advancement.
Wow, I think that that's a great, actually actionable thing that can happen. Senior researchers take note. So that's all of my questions for today. Megan, it was such a pleasure to get to know you and your research and kind of your approach to your work. I really enjoyed this, and I'm really looking forward to what we can see coming from you and your projects in the future.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was wonderful to meet you and get to know you as well.
And maybe we'll see in Sao Paulo in 2027, and I'll make sure to come and find you.
That would be great.
Okay.